Hey guys, webinar number 5. This one is about calling shoves. Last week we talked about ISOing in some spots. I have 6 hands, 5 examples with calls, 1 with an ISO. And basically we're going to be looking at thinking beyond just is something plus EV. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with making a call because it's plus EV. But our main focus should be what about future EV and things that Sit and Go Wiz might miss. So I took some screenshots from Huyan Sit and Go Wiz. Thank you. In this first hand, this is a great example of not calling because you can. Now, first thing you see is, like, as Dottie would say, what a F. How could you fold ace king? It's not ace king. It's these other hands that it says you can call. So first, as you know, we think about stage of the game, right? So 800, 1600, still chip EV, 180 man. What are you about? I don't know. You could be in the money here. I don't know, somewhere around 1800 or so. But this is a spot I was helping a guy, like a normal coaching session. He was doing a sweat session, and this is my attempt at recreating the hand. And he had Queen 3 of spades, and he snap called without even thinking. He just said, "Oh, I think that guy's on 100%. I snap call." Okay, totally fine in the EV world, but 80% of hands, like, you can call in a situation. What do you mean by nah, sir? Well, right. I mean, I would fold Queen 3 suited too. And this is a spot, though, where if we obey the rules of EV in this hypothetical world, you could call with Queen 3 of spades here. And even if I wish I could adjust this right now. If he's on 80%, I still think you could even call with Queen 3 suited, because this is saying there's 100 you can call with 9 deuce suited. So I bet if we took out 20, it would still say Queen 3 suited. But I'm not really too concerned if it's plus EV or not, because just like one of the first things we ever talked about way back when is common sense always outweighs something that's plus EV. Because calling here would just be like, boggles the mind, unless you're trying to prove a point. And that's why sometimes maybe in like a 9 or an 18, there might be more of a logical reason to call, because you're probably more likely to come across a player. Like if I was able to play and I came across Entim every single day of my life playing like an 18, but I didn't play 18s that often, at least calling with Queen 3 suited would create some type of future dynamic. But then like in 180s, it could create a dynamic, but you don't come across the player as often, so that dynamic doesn't get to recreate itself as often, if that makes sense. But I think what's interesting in this hand is if we look at different stack sizes for when you're deciding to call here. So the next hand is the same exact thing. This one's a little blurry. But now you have like 6,000-7,000 chips. So like, do you guys tend to call wider when you're shorter, even though in theory it's pretty much the same chip EV, give or take a little bit? What do you think, Morton? Like, let's say it was, you still knew a guy was on 80, 100%, whatever, crazy wide range, right? What's the difference? Yeah, I think that's a great point by Entim, right? It depends on like the future hands. Because if you fold with X stack, is X stack worth something to you in future hands? That's a great point. See? But you see what Entim's doing here, guys? Like, he's thinking like creatively and logically about what's going to happen in future hands. That's why, like, when we put a hand in Sit and Go Wiz, it's just this limited picture of right and wrong, basically. Like, I think that's superb that you're thinking that. So Chris says, sure, not always. We remember last webinar with Johan. Yeah, I mean, and that was a different kind of scenario because it was like being in middle position and having more guys behind you, or being in later position having a few guys behind you. Yeah. And this is, I 100% agree with this. So Tim's saying, like, if your 6K is not so valuable, call wider. And that would depend then, I guess, blind level would be an important consideration, like where you are in the game, how many people are left, what type of game. Maybe you're way closer to the money. Maybe this is, I don't even, just 45-man final table and it's totally different, but the stage of the game can kind of give an indication about the logic to apply in terms of, like, am I near money? Should I be risking it here? Should I not? Stuff like that. Morton says, I mean, if the table is so tight, why call wider? You have better spots to push yourself. That's another great point too. What about the players who are at the table? What if your entire table was, I don't know, someone really good, like Space Graver or something, It totally changes the dynamic of everything. Yeah, table is loose, call wider, because less good spots in the future. Good. And, in game, sometimes that's hard to detect, obviously. But I love that we think about that stuff outside of game, because it's cool to kind of wrap our brains around ideas like that. It's a great point, Morton. So Tim also says there will be a different dynamic from 20 players left to 16 players left, down to 12. Yeah. And that's exactly true, right? Because, like, as you approach the bubble, people get tighter. So that means there's going to be some more future spots. Then once the money bubble breaks, then you're at a full table with less late position spots, at least. But then people might be more willing to get a little looser. And then as you dwindle down and get shorthanded to where there's more late position spots, people get tighter. So it shifts. And that's really cool, is to always kind of be in tune with the stage of the game, because it implies a lot of cool stuff. That's a great point, Tim. Yeah. Exactly. So when I was doing the session with the guy, he snapped, and yeah, plus EV, okay. But it's just kind of it. There was no thought that went into it, Like, maybe if it's like Shen 888 is the shover, and you just, I don't know, you just need to stand up. There's a bully, and you got to be like, finally. Yeah, exactly. Like, so maybe it's like, prove something to him. And that's why I think when you make these calls in like a 9 or 18 where you come across the player more often, it kind of holds more weight, because now he's going to pop up in your games way more often, right? But also there's added value. And if you did knock Shen out, and boom, and there he says, and he said it. Boom. He's exactly right. The value of a good reg not being on the final table with you will increase your chances of winning substantially, especially if he's BBB versus you, because you're probably not going to get any leniency. And that's another example of future EV. Morton says, should we in general call regs wider, not only because we know they shove wide, but also to get them out? Yes and no. Because I think, like Tim said, it depends on, like, where you are, and then if whatever stack size you have has some type of future implied value. So, and that's some other hands I have, like, are good examples of that. But even in these first two, like, there's a big difference between having 10 big blinds and like 5, as why me would say, is like, when you have 10 big blinds, it's like a full life, like in a video game or something like that. And I think that's something that's pretty important here. Comments. Mark's right. Hopefully they'll notice. And that's why, like, in 9-mans, it's better because you can see them more, In terms of the meta game, not better in terms of the value. Because in a 180, it gets you closer to winning larger amounts of money. Stack sizes and stage of game, definitely, Morton. Tim says, depends on how much money he makes. Does he adjust after we call him? There are guys forward tabling and won't care if. Yes, and that's a great point too. And there's something to be said too about how players structure their sets. If you play Sip and Chris, who's great, he's stacking 25 games. So if he shoves and you call, he loses, and then his debustifier closes the game out. It's kind of the idea of like, if someone doesn't see what you're doing, then did it ever really happen? So you could even make a case. I've never actually done this. You could make a case for like typing stuff in the chat, make that guy remember or something. I don't know. Never actually done it. Chris says a lot of regs think like this: call regs with any ace, queen, jack, king 10, etc. because that's plus EV, and even if they lose a hand, they don't think it was good, or sorry, they don't think was it good or not so good. Right? It's just like, it's kind of like they have a checklist. It's like, okay, here comes the shove. Did I do it right? Yes. Okay, move on. Don't care. Tim says the point about regs developing a dynamic of a wide caller. Interested. I think it would exist between like you and Bubbleoutcas or something. That'd be cool. Is that almost all regs are too tight anyway when it comes to calling your plus EV pre-final table pushes. It's true. I mean, I definitely am. I call it 0% because I can't call anymore. But it's, you can just shove so wide in spots. I mean, but no one's calling. You know, the cliche like people don't call correctly. Well, in theory, correctly is 80% of hands, and that's just like disgustingly gross. Like, come on, that's gross. But I think Tim's right. Like, overall, people don't call optimally, but at the same time, I don't think there's a need in some cases to call optimally because there's future EV implications. So Tim says, so if they call them too wide and it's plus EV, they're still static when it comes to calling even wide pushes. They have limits. Yeah. Yeah. What are you pointing at, Morton? And that's a great point by Mark, defining what's optimal and what's plus EV. So he said, so if you call them too wide and it's plus EV, they're still static when it comes to calling even wide pushes. You want to explain that more in depth, Tim? You mean they have limits, like they won't adjust like out of their comfort zone? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like oh, King Deuce, I'll call you wide. But then that, because it's like that's how they get wide. Like they don't adjust completely. They like mini adjust or something. But then even the mini adjustment's not enough, I think. Dog's barking. And for Mark, he said like defining optimal versus plus EV. It's like the human element. Like trust your gut. You know, like let all of your hard work turn into some type of feeling. Someone's mic is on. So Chris says, from the other side, if you are a reg and you are better than other players at the table, there's no reason to take any plus EV situation. Somewhat true. I mean, there's definitely times to do it and sometimes not to. It's just it's determining for yourself in a spot. Is it worth it? Jason, mute your mic. So Dottie says, I think this static thing is kind of true when it comes to shoving as well. You call them wider, they're still going to shove so wide. Right. Because it only really makes people adjust if A, they notice, and like Tim said, it's harder for 40 tabling guys to notice. But then depends if someone actually has a brain. Like Tim's the type of player that I would hate to get into some type of metagame with because he has intelligence. And there are a lot of guys who play frequently who don't have that same kind of intelligence level. And so like I'm not like really worried about them like doing some metagame battle with me. But like with Tim, I'd be crapping my pants because I'd be like, oh, he's thinking this and I'm thinking this and he knows I'm thinking this because I know he's that smart, you know. So I think that's what's kind of interesting, Dottie. So Tim says they'll never call 2s, 3s, 4s, which have huge equity against a lot of King 2 stuff they're pushing. Yeah, I mean, some people do, some people don't. Like, I'm the type of guy who, depending on the situation, a lot of time I fold those. But I know there's a lot of guys, like Sippin' Chris is one of them. He'll literally call you with anything EV. Like, I mean, from playing so many 9-mans with him, I would shove like 11x heads up and he would call with Jack 8 offsuit. Just because it was Nash equilibrium. Like, literally, that was the reason why. Population of people who can't play anymore. I mean, overall, like my advice to you guys would just be like thinking of like stack size and future EV and the implications of that, and thinking like another thing is like just the logic of like if you lose, now what? So just think a step ahead. Like if I lose this, oh that's bad. I don't want to be in that spot, and maybe that could be reason to fold. And also Morton's favorite thing, stage of game, is something that can kind of imply like how meaningful your stack is in a future hand if you win or lose, and that kind of relates to what Tim's is saying. So it's kind of feels like we're all on the same page here. Love Sog. Okay, so looks like Love Song. So basically, you could always ask yourself like, what's the worst thing that can happen if we lose this hand? So Mark says, and I think we have to think, what if I lose, plus what percentage of the time do I lose? Yeah, and that's really interesting too. And you could even think, depending on the stack setup, like, are you out of the game if you lose? Because that would deny you 100% of future spots, which is important. And a lot of these marginal hands are barely favorites, like 55, 56 a lot of the time. I guess it just depends on the exact two hole cards, but if you did, like this guy had Queen 3 suited. I wonder what Queen 3 suited is versus ATC. Oops. Oh yeah. Woo. But there's sometimes when, hey, like even to call, like in a situation, just say you only have to be a 45% favorite or something like that. So yeah, it's plus EV and all that good stuff. Huh. As Dottie would say, what a edge. Okay. So any final comments about these two hands before we move on to the next set of hands? Uh-oh. Oh, okay. Whew. Standard procedure when I do this stuff. Okay. So moving on to the next one. Here we go. Okay. So this is an ISO spot. It's from the same guy's session. It's final table of a $15 180. And I did my best to recreate. The other stack sizes aren't perfect, but I definitely know what his was, and I know what the shovers was, and I remember for sure there was a guy with 5K here. So in this spot, this guy shoves 18K, so like 4.5 normal big blinds. And Hero had King Jack and snap ISO'd, which, okay, I can see that. It's not Queen 3 suited. Dog's going nuts today. So just looking at this, just off of your first reaction, do you guys ISO or... I guess in here we know his range is 80%. Let's just say you were in the moment and you had no idea and you just had to click a button. Yeah, I agree with Tim. Because you only are risking 18 of the 40. Yeah, reads do help. What if you just had to make a decision? Gun to your head. Well, I guess that would be like under the gun, but you're not under the gun. And even like in this spot, I guess the stacks that I just made up behind are actually in your favor, I guess. And that might have not been the stacks in the game. Single Wiz suggests ISOing. And drinking. Puyon says, is it not a big enough edge to justify it? I mean, And Jason says the stacks are perfect. These stacks aren't the real ones. The stacks are nice behind because they're a lot more comfortable. What if they both have like 50K? Yeah. Mark says in a vacuum he thinks it's a fold. But I agree completely. Small blind, big blind stacks change this a lot. Chris says he's not on ATC because why this hand? Not hand before, hand later, so he has some kind of range there. I agree. And the fact that if, like, say this was a rando and he was final table and there was a guy maybe with one big blind, if there's one thing randoms are good at, it's moving up pay scales. Like, come on, gotta make that money. Tim says randoms don't push King X, Queen 10 stuff if there's a one big blind stack. Yeah, yeah. I mean, because it doesn't take that good of a player to recognize that they're going to make more money. That's just like a human being thing. So really, the people who are going to shove wide here are going to be like degens who don't care, guys who are just like going for the big score, or a good player who's opening up his range. What do you mean? If big blind is why me, he's snapping 7-6 suited. But we're not the big blind. We're cut off. Tim says you might actually prefer Ace 8 to King Jack here. I think they respect Ace Deuce more than King 9. Yeah, exactly. They're more likely to have like Ace high hands. Because it's kind of like, I don't know. That's what they always do on TV though. Oh, Ace X. It's good. It's just kind of been like made into a strong hand. I don't know why. But it's a really good point because that's the hand that's directly going to dominate. But then King Jack, to have that same effect, I mean, so if Ace 8 you dominate 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so that's 6 total Ace X's. So he'd have to have King 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, King 5 through King 10 in order to have the same amount of dominated cards, at least for like the high card. And then maybe, I guess, maybe a Jack 10 or something. So maybe if he has King 6 through King 10 and Jack 10, then that would be equivalent to Ace 8 versus Ace Deuce. But like Tim said, and people seem to agree, I agree too, way more likely to lean toward Ace X than King 5. Neil says, hold on, Chris says, he agrees with Tim. If guys are random, there's almost no hand that we are ahead from. I mean, there might be a few that you dominate, like some 2 Broadway cards, but definitely Ace 8 seems better. Neil says when blinds going up, they consider the effect on their range. That's true too. How soon till the blinds are 5K? That can have an effect. Also, what's interesting is with a program like Wiz, when you put them on X%, you can't custom their range to Ace 2 through, like Ace Deuce plus, but then King 10 plus, because it has these default percentages. So we either have to use feel or do it all by hand. Feels good though. Tim says his range is not. Yeah. Oh, okay. There you go. You can take out Queen 9 Jack 10 if he's only willing to push Ace Deuce plus because he's a donk. They do love the Mace Rags. It's very true. Yeah, and agree with Jason too. And we know that King Queen is like a bajillion times better. T4K. Oh, big blind 4K. Yeah. Oh, so. So anyway, this is similar to like that webinar, webinar 3 with the drinking or ISOing. Just so you know, Tim, ISO equals getting drunk. I don't know. Dottie started it. So we're looking at stack sizes behind. But now we want to think about the future EV, especially because it's a final table, right? So now take this hand where you have 40K. Now let's tweak the scenario. And obviously that didn't work the way I wanted it to. Well done, man. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, that's future hand. I got confused. So same spot. What if you made this a $3 rebuy? Then what? Different SOG. Right, Chris. At this stage of the $3 rebuy, it'd probably be 25, 26 handed, I think. Yeah, somewhere around 30. Tim says fold probably. The spots in $3 rebuys are generally better. They have worse players. They play tighter with what they consider a bigger stack. That's a great point too. It's a great point. It's definitely better in a $3 rebuy, but does that mean that this is still some type of a snap? Oh my God, it's huge plus EV situation. Now, let's say that we knew the shover was ridiculously wide in both situations. Okay. Let's just say there's no dynamic. We just know that guy's really wide and we know it for sure. Difference between these two hands. My internet's not going out. Woo. Oh, knock on wood. Yeah. So that's him saying if you know. Morton says, I much rather call this with 30 people left in a 3 than a final table in a 7. Yeah, agree for sure. Because it's the whole stage of game, tangible money, future hands, you know, dollar EV versus chip EV, all that kind of stuff. Logic and common sense versus plus EV. The spot is so much sexier far away from the money. It's true. It's true. So it has a little cleavage in this spot. It's it's a better spot. Dottie says, am I always drunk or we're not so short in a $3 rebuy when 30 left? Do you mean you're always ISOing here? Is that what you mean? Okay. Oh, so you're using drunk in a real way. So you're saying, like, are you always missing this, that you're not so short? I don't think I'm clear on what you mean. Oh, just actually drunk. Full beer glass. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, because this is like pretty normal situation, I think, in like a $3 rebuy. The stacks might be different though, because that's what's interesting about $3 rebuys is since there's like what 700,000-800,000 chips, the chips can be kind of distributed in so many unique ways when you're this deep. Oh yeah, the others probably have a little more chips than normal, or I mean, no, compared to this, because I did change the hand situation, but I kept the stacks the same. So that's, I think I half answered that. Sorry. But yeah. So does anyone actually ISO here with Jack 8 offsuit? Because you can. No. No. And that's what leads to this next thing, which is that, like, I should not say plus EV is overrated. I mean the term plus EV is overrated. And I want to talk about like misconceptions. And the first one is the take every plus EV spot. Call this. If you want to take every plus EV spot, call this with Queen 8. And like none of us would ever do that. And that's why it's just so weird to be like, you should take every spot. It's like, I don't know. It just seems so gross. Like, what's the widest you guys would ISO here, knowing that this guy's a wide player? Okay. And I'm sure, obviously, that I think it'll definitely change. Let's say both situations. What's the widest you call final table? What's the widest you call $3 rebuy? You know, there's situations, this could be an MTT with like 1,000 people left out of 5,000 or something. That's totally different too, you know? Yeah, let's just say that we know our assumption is he's shoving wide. You just don't know for a fact. You just have an assumption. Seems reasonable. Oh, have the hiccups. Seems reasonable, Chris. Tim says, we're happier following Single Wiz's advice to push really wide in spots, but when it comes to calling spots, obviously chip EV is flawed in that we don't want to be out of the tournament to a certain extent. Bingo bango. I think that's really good. Exactly, because calling is not the same thing as shoving. Even if calling and shoving were both plus X, where X is just a constant or whatever, in whatever situation, when you call, and like what Tim's saying, if you're out, you could call, like with that queen 3 suited in the last example, and win 52% of the time, but then you're out 48% of the time. So 48% of the time, you miss out on everything later on that could have been good. 48% of the time, it's gone. But if you fold 48% of the time, well, 100% of the time, you still have those opportunities. And assuming you know what you're doing, which, yeah, you guys know what's up, right? You know your ranges and stuff like that. And you know where to look for spots and create invention value and raise the steal and all that kind of stuff. 100% of the time when you fold queen 3 suited, you still have those options available for the rest of the game, at least until you bust. But then when you call queen 3 suited or king jack or whatever that spot is, whatever the amount of time is you're going to lose versus that range that guy's shoving with whatever specific hand you have, that's the percentage of time you miss out on all those future edges and all the future things that your skill is going to create. Seems fine, Morton. So Tim says, shove, we're confident of our percentage of getting folds and can calculate range and push. Calling, we have to factor we're always going to showdown and risking 100% of the time. Shoving, yeah, exactly. And that's in these misconceptions, the last one, we could skip to it, is calling shoves is high variance. And one of those things is because when you call shoves, you only have one source of equity, and that's showdown equity. But when you shove, you get folding equity and showdown equity. And the folding equity is so important. Dottie says, I'd even fold sevens on the final table, which would be fine, although a lot closer, but totally fine. This guy is shoving when there's a one big blind stack of the table and two more is shorter than him. Yeah, exactly, and we would think that that's affecting his range. I would fold sevens versus a random there, because it's kind of what you say and what Tim says too about there being a one big blind stack. It would alter his range. One thing that's interesting about the sevens now, I think it kind of depends on your stack. Because even though sevens is better than king jack, you know, depending on the stack setup, depending on the situation, there could be a lot more future equity. And so one of these hands coming up will be a kind of similar spot to this, but with a different stack. Here I could, little spoiler alert now. Like, what if it was the same situation, but you had 100K? It's totally different. And we'll get to that in a sec. So, can agree. It's kind of the same way, Tim, like how you said they shove with ace-x, like how they might shove with all pairs. It's more likely. Because like, ooh, any pair, any ace. Chris says, there was a subject on forum, what's the difference between sevens and eights if they have most of the time broadways here? That's a great question. There's almost no difference. There's maybe a slight mathematical difference from like board pairing and stuff like that. But isn't maybe the difference would just be like a subtle thing in like blockers or something. Like if you have sevens versus king queen offsuit, you're 53, and it's the same thing. There you go. There's your answer. It's the same. Now what if you do nines? It might be a subtle difference because a 9 is needed to flop a straight for king queen. So then if you block a straight, you get a little bit more equity or something. It's kind of cool. Tim says, do you think it's more likely that this player has 3-3, 80% spot for us, very nice, or that he has queen jack offsuit, 75% is still quite nice? Wouldn't he just be more likely to have like queen jack? Because even if you have king jack, there's still 12 queen jacks, and then there would be 6 of 3-3. So I guess it's still twice as likely he has queen jack. Yeah, stuff like this would probably small differences, like Puyan said. Let's see. Oh, when 7s versus 3s and king jack versus queen jack. But wouldn't he still be just more likely to have queen jack just based on like pure combinations of possibilities of having the hand? Oh, or you just mean like in terms of like which hand would he choose to shove? Or do you, or I'm confused. Which one? Both? I don't know. I think that people would, yeah, I think people would choose 3-3 over queen jack. Like a random, like, oh, it's a pair, like that's my comfort zone, you know, because they know that a pair is a shove, but maybe they're not so sure of queen jack, they're hesitant. But then in pure math, is if they shove both equally as often, queen jack would be more. Oh, someone joined. Wow, lots of people here. Cool. Am I reading this wrong? 7s versus deuces plus? Shouldn't it be like 80-20? Oh, all pairs. Ah, yeah. Oh, okay. That's cool. It's only 45. Yeah, because there's more pairs that beat you. That makes sense. So like 8s is the middle. Yeah, that's like why they call ace 8 dead man's hand, right? Because it's like the middle ace. It's a made hand. That's a really good point, because I bet you that's a subtlety that people, I mean, like subconsciously, that is a big reason why people shove pairs, because they know they have the best hand pre-flop kind of thing. It's a made hand. That's a great point, Jason. Tim says, so that's why I prefer 7s to king jack in a calling range. Yeah, it's good, man. Just because someone's way more likely to choose 3s in the situation. Okay, so some other things that are kind of some misconceptions, like this, you know, the whole take every plus EV spot. So here's the same stack setup, but now it's like pure chip EV. Hey, guess what? 10-6 suited is worth 200 chips, like plus EV. That's disgusting. Other misconceptions are like the default assumption, like call versus reg, fold versus random kind of thing. How people just instantly will say, oh, well, versus reg, yes, versus random, no, or something, or even vice versa. Then 3-3 suited. Okay, true. Other things are like the whole sit and goes are solved, you know, and like how push fold can, in a weird way, I guess, be solved in a vacuum if we just tried to like listen to all the rules and stuff like that. But then like this forgets about all that stuff that we talked about and through all coachings and previous webinars, like convention value and stuff. Another misconception is that there is a correct calling range, and that's what's so hard, because in these spots, like, it's up to you guys to decide when does it feel right to do something and when does it not, even if both things are in a vacuum plus EV. Puyan says calling versus reg / calling versus random, we're not adjusting. No, I mean, what I mean by that is, you know how sometimes people say like, oh, I'd call this versus a reg and I'd fold it versus a random. Just like a very like not thinking way of analyzing a situation, kind of like trying to simplify it as much as possible, you know? And there's a lot of spots where like that can damage us. There's a lot of spots where just a lot of cliche things to think about, it can damage how I play, because it's like, oh, I call versus a reg. Okay, what type of reg? You know, stuff like that. Like, who is this guy? You know, like, I guess we can kind of think like that sometimes, like in a small portion of the way. But if when we simplify things that much, it can kind of get wrong, just like really, really wrong, because there's a lot more to it, you know. But that's all the things that we're talking about. We're thinking beyond just plus EV, and like all the things you guys are talking about is great. Tim says versus randoms, we can approximate when we think they will feel desperate in a stack setup. That is a great point right there. And that comes from feel, right? And experience and just noticing those things. That's a great point, man. He also says, and just play a guessing game based on that for calling nice and wide. Right. And then you mix that with the other things we talked about earlier, like how you were saying, you know, is this stack meaningful to me if I fold? All those like feel-based things. It's a great point, man. Someone's mic is on. Hello there. And the last one that we already kind of talked about was that calling shoves is high variance in terms of like, you know, the whole showdown equity versus fold equity, right? Because if you shove, it's low variance or something like that. I've also heard things that say like low edges in sit and go whiz are high variance, and then the higher the edges, the smaller variance it is. And that's not always true, because calling will create more what people would call variance, but it really is just creating swings. And so it's important to think like variance just means a deviation from the mean expected outcome. But then depending on how you play, you create your own mean expected outcome by the style of your play. If you're the type of guy who always calls, and I used to be like that at one point, like when I learned range, I was like, oh, I'm gonna snap your ass, right? I was like everywhere calling people with queen 4 for 10x because I knew yes, this is plus EV for versus an ATC range or stuff like that. But I was changing my mean expected outcome when I was making those calls, because I was consenting to small edges there instead of taking future edges later that might be less risky or even a bigger edge, right? And so then when my results would vary from that mean, it was a different type of variance. But I think what's really interesting is that I think the word we're looking for here is not variance, as it gets misused a lot. Like, I'm having a downswing, man. What a fuck, variance. But it's swings, because variance is just a deviation from the mean expected outcome. But your style of play can help dictate where your expected outcome lies. Hope that kind of made sense. But then it's like the whole, what we mentioned earlier, calling shoves create swings because you have one source of equity, and it's exactly what Tim said earlier, and that form of equity is showdown equity only. Dottie says, I'm still thinking about queen jack versus threes. They can have 16 queen jacks and 6 threes. Do you think that they will shove all threes, but they won't shove 6 queen jacks? That's a really great point, and I actually analyzed that wrong, because I was looking at king jack and thinking if they have queen jack, there's only 12 combos left. But if we have sevens here, then there's 16 combos of queen jack. But then if he's shoving 6 queen jacks, which is, what is 6? What percentage of the time is that? 37.5% of the time if he shows all his queen jacks, or 37% of queen jacks, that would be the same number of combinations as threes. Oh, that's fun, Dottie. Chris says that, in his opinion, randoms won't shove queen jack above 6 big blinds. It just depends on the scenario. Like what Entim said, you have to notice when you sense a guy is feeling desperate because of the situation. So even though I could say that maybe I agree with this partly, but the majority of the time it really just depends on the unique setup of the game. And that's why I think what Entim said is cool about sensing when someone's getting desperate. And I think that comes from experience a lot. So Tim says they won't shove any queen jacks, and nice apostrophe there, so I know what you mean. They won't shove any queen jacks and will push 6 3-3s. And so if we have sevens, let's call for his low pairs and fade his broadways, because we have deduced he is weighted towards made type hands. Yeah, dude, that's a great point. Wow, that's a really great point. That makes me want to snap sevens in spots, because these are like the small pairs and the aces. Those are the comfort zones when people think that it's okay to shove. So their hands get weighted away from the 2 Broadway cards and more towards the hands that you crush. So even though when you call with 7s, it's like, oh, I'm going to race. Well, not really if his range is weighted away from those hands. That's a really good point, man. So Jason says they could shove Queen Jack 50% of the time. Then it's 8 versus 6. That sounds reasonable, right? Half the time they shove Queen Jack, because we don't know. Like, some guys are going to do it, some guys are not. So maybe we could say, hey, half the time. So what if we did, how'd you do the poker stove thing? Do the same thing, but make it 8 combinations of Queen Jack or something. If you did 7s, and then we did 3s, we're doing verse 3s, and half of Queen Jacks. Wow. 63. Puyon says, I think what they're talking about is the tendencies of randoms. Yeah. Valuing pairs more than Queen Jack. And I think the underlying reasoning is probably exactly what Jason said. Well, brain fart, what did Jason say? It's a made hand. I think that's so cool. Chris says, that's actually a good point. Why is 8-8 better than 7s? Yeah, it almost makes no difference sometimes, huh? Tim says, people don't do things 50% of the time in a sit and go. That is balancing. They will do things 100% of the time, usually in any given situation. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the guy. Because I agree with that in the sense that, like, people have a predetermined response to things that they're used to. You know, like, this is what I do. This is what I do again. But then there are other types of players who, maybe depending on the situation, either nerves get the best of them, they get confused because of the high intensity of a situation, like final table and there's a bunch of money around or something like that, you know? Or overall, there's some guys who might just be kind of like random cannons, you know? And sometimes they do this, sometimes they do that. It's like, how can you predict them, you know? But I do think that there are a bulk number of players who do have kind of a default response. So then he adds, but it's best to assume they have predetermined response one way or the other. We will approach each guy that balances or plays about with ranges or on an individual basis. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with just assuming a guy has a predetermined response and playing accordingly. I think that's fine. Neil says they will probably shove 4 of them. Oh, that is true. So that would probably alter that poker stove thing a little bit. Because if you were going to shove Queen Jack, they would probably shove the suited ones first. Morton, how are you running? Call if you're running good and fold if you're running bad. Jason says they aren't balancing, but the villains you're facing. You mean, Jason, do you mean like the villains you're facing are approximately like the same overall? Is that what you mean? There you go. There you go. Jason says you can deduce from HUD stats which ones are more likely to shove Queen Jack. Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, and Dottie, they could be probably less likely to shove on a final table, especially with whoever mentioned before about the stack sizes here. And that's what's cool about stack sizes is, you know, in a regular game, there's 270,000 chips in play. Now, how are they distributed, right? Because it can cause people to do things that differ from game to game because of the different stacks. So Chris says 8s for 7s against regs ranges. It almost doesn't matter against randoms, which are more likely to push pairs than weaker broadways. It's almost 4%. Yeah, I mean, that 4% is a big difference there. I think it does somewhat matter against regs because, I mean, at least regs here. Well, actually, it's just going to alter a few hands, I guess, like the ace 8s, stuff like that. But now you have like slight blockers to some of the pairs because if you have a blocker to a pair, then there's only 3 combos left. But yeah, I think there's some difference, but definitely agree. Probably more versus random. So Jason says all of them will shove 3s 100% of the time, but the smarter 50% will shove Queen Jack. Yeah. Tim adds ace-8, ace-7 type hands and the value of meeting another pair. Yeah. Yeah. Sevens versus sevens would be crazy. And I guess another thing has to be said for how many people are at the table and like card removal effect. Oh my god, we can go into this for days. Jeez. Okay. I'm going to show you guys these last hands right here. Last one. What about other sources of income? Okay, so I took the same hand, but I altered the stacks to give us 100,000 here. And we're going to work under the assumption this is a final table. So you have 25 eggs. So what we have to remember is even though something is profitable, notice if he's still on 80%, let's say a good player shoves, and I don't know, some range around there, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 70, whatever, you know. There's a lot of hands that are plus EV. Even if he was tighter, let's say it was a hand like, I don't know, King 10, King Jack again, right? Now this spot has future implications because with your stack size, there's a lot of future income in different forms of doing a play, you know? So, because our goal is to maximize EV, not to just do something plus expected value. So folding can create sometimes more profitable and more frequent minimal risk spots. A great example is like stuff like this when you're at final tables and you fold, and it gives you a great situation where you preserve your stack on purpose, right? You don't chop off your balls. That just means, for those not knowing, just preserve your stack, right? Don't lose your power. But that power and leverage can earn you more value in future hands. So sometimes when we call off, we sacrifice that value. And especially the more skilled you are at executing those plays, and when you are flatted and getting around post flop spots, the more skills you are in that, the more profitable your on purpose fold becomes. So that's what I mean here when I say, like, if you are not properly attacking people in future hands and inventing, right, plus invention value, the future EV spots, if you're not inventing value, then your on purpose fold decreases in value. Like, let's just say that our hero here is a push fold robot, and he can't shove on future hands unless he has a profitable, or I should say a standard profitable shove. Then he's going to miss out on opportunities to raise in future hands. So then his fold isn't worth as much to him because he's not taking those future spots. And the other thing was that if when you call, it can remove those future plays, like the raise fold to steal and whatever else there could be, invention value, there could be tons of stuff, you know. And sometimes when you call, you, in whatever the situation is, you could be ruining your stack to the point where those plays aren't an option anymore. Here, maybe not so much if it's 18K, but there could be a situation here where the guy's shoving 40K and you have king queen, and you go, oh, for whatever reason, you know that guy's wide and you're going to call, but now when you lose, you're down to 50 and it changes future value of hands. Doesn't mean it's always a fold, but it means that we should be entertaining that idea. Puyon mentions more bias to folding here because we can play the big stack with a bigger edge in future spots, yeah. And less risk. But who are the players at the table? What if everybody at this table was a player like Phil Ivey? He'd be like, oh damn, he's gonna wreck my ass, like he's gonna destroy me, you know? So maybe this is a spot where you should just try and get as many chips as possible because Phil Ivey's just gonna destroy you in every single spot. Tim says we'd have to entertain how many Queen 10, King 9 type dominating situations we'd have to be sold to the deal of calling King Queen. Yeah, exactly. And then it kind of relates back to that original idea. Based on the shover, how likely is it that his range is comprised of hands we dominate? Because that's the only way that I would call here is like if I just thought, oh my god, I'm dominating that guy so freaking often, it's not even funny, you know? Like if he showed me, it's what's funny though. Like if I had 10-9 offsuit and he showed me 10 deuce, I would ISO jam the 100K for his 40K stack. Because it's like you're what, 70-30, 75-25 or whatever, right? Like I want that dominated thing. Obviously, he's like, we're never actually going to do that in game. Like that would be nuts. Mark says, and the better you play with a big stack, the more you should protect it. Exactly. You know how much control you have on small raises and playing posts and all that, because that's all future EV. You know, and that's what was mentioned up here. Like final table equals tons of future EV if you know how to use your stack right. You know, it's like having controlled aggression. We're not just going psycho. We're going psycho under control. You know, I don't know who you're talking about, but I'll just pretend it's me. Thanks. I do suck. Oh, Phil Ivey. What a fuck. Okay. So, in summary of all this stuff, just the term EV is overused and misunderstood. We should always be thinking beyond the basics and beyond just EV. Think of other ways you can make money, because there's not always one source of income. It's not just push, fold, call kind of stuff. And most importantly, that folding folding plus EV calls can lead to less swingy, not high variance, less swingy and better results. And it can give you many more plus future EV spots of higher value and less risk in the future. And overall, it'll increase your win rate substantially, because you're just not going to lose games as often on those calls. You know how in the very first hand, the guy in the coaching session called with Queen 3 suited. And it was like, okay, but now what? You know, it's just, oh, it's plus EV, end of discussion. Tim says, overjamming is getting really good at low mid-stake sit and goes, pushing 20 big ones in spots where it'd be better to raise call from most regs. So if we push 20 big blinds into 2 opponents with King Jack, but 2 of the shorter opponents had just 4 to 5 big blinds. Yeah, I mean, it just depends on the situation. Like, there's definitely times, like, when I like overjamming spots is when I'm preventing someone from reshoving in a spot where I don't want to raise call, or where I think I'm just being completely ripped apart by said reg, you know. So I think there's definitely some merit into making some overshoves in some key spots. Thanks, I guess. I mean, all I want you guys to do is to think while you play, and to not just try and repeat plays. Like, I don't want you to go play a session and be like, oh, I'm going to fold here because that's what I learned to do. I'm going to fold. I want you to fold and know why you're folding, because when you know why, it's going to help you for future hands, because you're learning in that moment. When you can, in the moment, in game, tell yourself, this is why I'm folding. And when you're confident in that, that's a huge deal, because that means that you internally actually understand this stuff. And that means that it's going to creep into your play in different spots that may be the same, slightly similar, maybe totally different. But when you get that core principle down and it becomes a part of your thinking process, that's something that can help so much in future hands. Plus a bunch. Tim says they can hero fold big hands with a small stack based on you pushing a lot of big blinds. Yeah, it's true. And it's all about just finding the situation. I said that they would have pushed if you raise 2 big blinds. They push a 7 because they feel short. And you're like, yeah, exactly. Like, and that's the whole thing. It's like in some situations you can prevent that from happening. Puyon says, oh my God. It's so easy not to think why, and it's so true, because so often when you multi-table, you find yourself in robot land, just clicking buttons. And it's so important to just take the time and think, because the more you think now, the more you're going to be prepared for future spots. Tim says, but 20 big blinds, they put you on ace king and fold a bunch of huge ones. Yeah, it's so true. A lot of people just, oh, ace king. any other questions about anything, and I'll send you these notes, Puyan. But when it all comes down to it, no matter what you do, just win. Whatever. Misclick, do whatever, table ninja shove on accident, just win. Yeah, ballers get there. Non-US ballers will get there. Oops, that's not. Oh no. Fabio shows up. See you guys.